Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We still got some people joining us, but thank you all very much for being here this morning for our very first panel discussion of staying above water. My name is Sarah Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Portland Landmarks. And for those of you who are new to Landmarks, we are a historic preservation organization whose mission is to identify, preserve, and revitalize Greater Portland's remarkable legacy of historic buildings, neighborhoods, landscapes, and parks through advocacy and education. So Greater Portland's coastal location has informed so much of our history and our built environment. And many of our most treasured sites, from Native American shell middens to seaside neighborhoods, forts, wharves, and industry, are located along the coast or rivers and streams. Our climate is changing, and those resources are at risk due to rising sea levels and increased flooding. And already, some of our waterfront neighborhoods, like Portland's working waterfront and Bayside, experience flooding during extreme rain and king tides. Predictions by the Maine Climate Council's Science and Technology Advisory Group tell us to prepare for 4 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and up to 9 feet by 2100. As preservationists, we need to prepare for the severe impact that rising seas will have on our coastal communities. Our historic neighborhoods and commercial centers face unprecedented risks. This symposium will look at the history of our changing coastline and communities, assess the risks we face, and present adaptation and mitigation strategies for the future. Before we start, I want to be sure and thank our sponsors, WCSH News Center Maine, Gardner Real Estate, Heritage Company Coppersmiths, J.B. Brown and Sons, Sacco and Biddeford Savings Institution, Clark Insurance, and Maine Home and Design. And this symposium is also supported in part by a Maine Bicentennial Project Grant from the Maine Arts Commission. Thank you as well to our preservation partners, our members, our board, our amazing staff, and to all of our supporters. All of you make this work possible. So today's discussion is about the past. How has the past shaped our present and impacted our vulnerability to rising sea levels? Our panelists today are Dr. Arthur Spiess and Christi Chapman-Mitchell of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and Dr. Libby Bischof of the University of Southern Maine. Dr. Spiess is the Chief Historic Preservationist and is responsible for identifying and protecting significant archaeological sites and making nominations of sites to be included in the National Register of Historic Places. Ms. Chapman-Mitchell is the Assistant Director and Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Maine. And Dr. Bischof is a Professor of History and the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education at USM. So how this is going to work is each panelist is going to give a brief presentation, and then we will have time for Q&A. So please go ahead as your questions come up and type them into the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and then we'll hopefully have time to answer all of your questions at the end. So right now, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Art.
Good morning, everybody. Get my slides going here. Good morning. This morning we're briefly going to turn our attention to the effects of climate change on archaeological sites in the Greater Portland and Casco Bay areas for various reasons, primarily dealing with the availability of historic written records. We think of archaeological sites in 2 categories: Native American pre-European sites and historic sites that are mostly European American in origin, such as colonial sites. And we'll return to the Native American sites later. The primary threat to Greater Portland area archaeological sites from climate change, of course, is sea level rise. In the Greater Portland area, historic archaeological sites that are under threat include 17th and 18th century European settlement and fishing stations and forts, among other types of sites. The 17th century fishing station on Richmond Island in Cape Elizabeth comes to mind as a prime example of such an early site. This map shows by half-kilometer square the historic archaeological site locations around Greater Portland and Casco Bay, and it includes shipwrecks, most of the ones in the water. And there are maritime trade-related sites such as wharves in the area. But shipwrecks are perhaps the most at threat, especially the ones that are in the intertidal zone, at risk from sea level rise. Shipwrecks that are subtidal, of course, are not at risk, so we're primarily concerned with the intertidal zone here. And at the small end of the shipwreck size range, there are dugout canoe archaeological sites. There are a couple from beaches in the intertidal zone, one from a beach in Biddeford, and indeed, the one from a beach in Biddeford, and indeed most dugout canoes in Maine are so far historic European in origin. But as a good transition to the next topic of Native American sites, a dugout was recovered last year from the intertidal zone in Kennebunkport, shown here, and it dates to 1300 AD, so it must be Native American in origin. As background to the Native American site archaeology section, I'm going to spend a little more time since it may be a less familiar topic to many of you. There is a reasonable picture of Native American life in Maine, just as it was just before the arrival of Europeans. That view is derived from native traditional stories, archaeological information, and written records of the very earliest European explorers and settlers. Maine Native Americans all spoke closely related languages of what is now called the Algonquian language family. They were hunters, fishers, and gatherers who moved seasonally by canoe along the coast and across the interior waterways in birch bark canoes during open water season. In southwestern Maine, some people raised corn, beans, and squash in small fields next to their summer houses. Along the coast, Native people operated tidal fish weirs. They collected clams, they hunted, and they moved seasonally to places of concentrated fish migration runs. And they put their canoes up, of course, during winter and moved on snowshoes, pulling toboggans if they're in the interior. They continued to gather clams and fish when possible along the coast in the winter. There are few pre-European Native American archaeological sites surviving on the mainland in the Portland area because of extensive land use change. Again, here's a map, half-kilometer squares, showing the Native American sites, mostly on the islands of Casco Bay. And we show these site locations as half-kilometer squares to give a sense of site location and density, but to protect the exact site locations, the point locations, most of which are on private property. These archaeological sites contain stone, bone, and pottery artifacts that are the cultural record of ancestors of Maine's modern tribes and the people before them. They are important to the cultural heritage of Maine's tribes, providing a sense of place to tribal members, much as National Register listed buildings provide a sense of place to our modern culture. The quote on this slide is from Dr. Bonnie Newsom. She's a Penobscot Nation member and archaeology professor at the University of Maine in Orono. Most of the coastal Native American campsite locations involved collecting shellfish, primarily clams, the shells on site and creating what archaeologists call a shell midden. Shell middens have enough shell to buffer Maine's acid soils and thus preserve bone, food animal bone, and bone tools. In addition to being culturally important, these middens preserve a record of environmental change along the Gulf of Maine shore. Campfire charcoal records the local wood species that were used for firewood. Food animal bones record the relative abundance of fish, bird, and mammal species at or near the location. Shells record what was going on ecologically in the local clam flat, and one can use various laboratory techniques to extract information on the season of death of these animals, what the animals are eating, what dogs and humans are eating, and even recently to extract ancient DNA to examine fish and mammal biology. That's all from these archaeological sites. Relative sea level rise and coastal erosion is a familiar topic to Maine archaeologists. Relative sea level rise is a part of the local geology caused by the last ice age and a combination of the subsequent rise in ocean levels worldwide and local Gulf of Maine subsidence of the underlying bedrock. The maximum relative land exposure occurred about 12,000 years ago, 12,000 years, shown here by the red line, which is now under 200 feet of water. I think you can see Casco Bay fairly clearly there. What is now Seguin Island off the Kennebec River mouth was a high hill on a coastal promontory 12,000 years ago. Native people have lived on the coast over these 12 millennia as sea level has risen. We know because fishermen, mostly scallop draggers, bring up stone tools from ancient campsites that are now underwater. Nothing seems to have survived in these sites except for the stone tools, and that's what's going to be left of any sites that are currently eroding. For example, there is a 5,000 to 6,000 year old spear point on the lower right in this slide from an underwater ledge off Halfway Rock in the middle of outer Casco Bay. We can reconstruct what is now Halfway Rock based on the sea level at the time as a 10-acre tree-covered island, apparently a very nice place to camp 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Of course, canoe accessible only. As sea level rose, Casco Bay and its river estuaries gradually flooded. The oldest preserved shell midden in Casco Bay on Mosher Island has a 4,000-year-old occupation layer at the bottom of the site. Roughly 4,000 years ago, what is now Mosher Island was a bluff at the confluence of the Presumpscot and Royal River estuaries, as shown in this crude reconstruction. So the pre-European Native American archaeological sites that have survived above the tide line today, mostly shell middens that are loaded with cultural and environmental information, provide a detailed look into a window of time that is about 4,000 years wide or 4,000 years old. Even though that's only a portion of Maine's prehistory, that is a lot more perspective than 200 years of fish and wildlife records or other historical environmental records provide, at least in terms of time depth. Most of the native coastal shell midden sites today are going to erode over the next century at an accelerating rate as sea level rises faster because of climate change. Sites that might have been around for the next 1,000 years under normal rates of sea level rise will disappear within a century or two because of climate change. Moreover, sea level rise will accelerate destruction of the European American coastal archaeological sites as well. As I see it, there are three options or actions open to archaeologists and historic preservationists. First is a triage approach to record and understand the sites that are here now in enough detail to know what will be lost and prioritize the most important or significant sites for action. In some cases, erosion control is a stopgap measure that can buy time. It is expensive and it might buy 50 or 100 years of time. High visibility, high priority archaeological sites such as the 17th century village at Pemaquid State Historic Park are good places for this approach. This slide shows an erosion control action installed there about 6 years ago. Finally, we can do data recovery archaeology excavation with best available current techniques, process the collection, including shells, charcoal, and other samples in the lab and get them stable and recorded, and then store those collections in museums for future research. This approach is limited by the number of archaeologists and volunteers available and the amount of museum space, and most obviously, all those factors are limited by the amount of financial support that's available. So in conclusion, we do what we can, but we're just going to lose a lot of archaeology in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Art. Really appreciate that. That was a great presentation. I'm going to just go ahead and transition right over to Libby now. Oh, Libby, you're still on mute.
Good morning. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for attending, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Art. One of the things before I begin, I'm going to share 6 or 7 historic maps this morning that can help us think about sea level rise and climate change. But I'd like to, and especially in the spirit of Art's presentation too, before I do that, I would just like to offer a land acknowledgement for Machagon, which is the truest name in Maliseet poet Miku Paul Anderson's words of the now called city of Portland, Maine, where the Osher Map Library sits and where I sit on the campus of the University of Southern Maine. And so just acknowledging, even as we look at land use change over time, I sit on land this morning that was once part of a water-based ecosystem. I sit on fill, which for thousands of years before the English and French even set foot on the neck, provided for the indigenous peoples of the Dawnland, the Wabanaki. And so we acknowledge this truth as we acknowledge the contemporary presence of our Wabanaki neighbors, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, and the Abenaki. And as we acknowledge some of the devastation of settler colonialism, past and present, which feeds into certainly discussions of climate change and sea level rise. So I'm going to share my screen and with you do a deep dive into a few maps. And as soon as I'm done talking, before Christy goes, I am going to go ahead and put a document that has this map list in the chat so you can visit and take a closer look at these maps yourself. So right now you're seeing a GIS overlay that was done in 2006 by Rosemary Mosher. This was done in conjunction with an exhibit on the history of Portland and mapping that the Osher Map Library and Smith Center did about 15 years ago now. And I just wanted to do a deep dive in this before we start with some of the historical maps, just to acknowledge the intentional human change in the landscape. And for me, when I'm thinking about the topic of our panel this morning, how has the past shaped our present and impacted our vulnerability? Past decisions about land use, about infrastructure, about transportation. I think the growth and change in transportation over time is such an important part of this conversation and will really guide our deep dive into some maps this morning. But when you're looking at this image in front of you now, this is Falmouth, the Neck, now Portland, as it looked in 1776 and 1777 when DeBars surveyed the coast. And so that is the land overlaid on top of an aerial photograph from 2001. So it'd be wonderful if we could redo this for 2020 because it would look quite different now. But just to give you a sense of the tremendous amount of fill, right? The constructed environment made by humans in a choice to expand this growing city. Not only the fill on the back cove, which you can see on the top, but certainly the creation of Commercial Street and the extension of the wharves that happened, starting in 1850 and into 1852. So the next time you're walking on Commercial Street, recognize that, 200 plus years ago, and certainly for the millennia prior that Art was talking about, you would have been literally walking on water. And this is true in most New England coastal cities, probably most famously Boston. You can go to Quincy Market today, and if you look down on the cement, they've actually built the former shoreline onto the cement, so you can see that themselves. I think it would be great if the city of Portland would do that, actually, to kind of show the former shoreline. But in our collections at the Osher Map Library, we have about 500,000 maps, and more than 75,000 of them are fully digitized and online. And one of the reasons that I decided to take you into the maps this way this morning, rather than showing slides, is that you can do a deep dive digitally into these maps. As a 19th century historian, I'm always going to encourage you to come and see the physical and to work with the physical materials. But certainly now and in COVID times, these are available to you at your fingertips at any time. And so I wanted to look at Cyprian Southwick's 1764, the harbor of Casco Bay and islands adjacent. And Southwick came over from England and elsewhere. He was fought in he commanded a ship during the 7 Years' War, stayed around. But he was known as an excellent draftsman. I find his map very elegant. But one of the things I think these historic maps can help us to understand is they literally help us to see a couple of things. They help us to track change over time, which is at the core of what any historian is always trying to figure out. And they allow us to see things that we can no longer see, things that are no longer here. But I think these maps are so important in talking about sea level rise, is to look at what he did as, this is a chart, right? So this is focused on the coast. It's focused on the ocean. This is to guide your sailing. It's less concerned with what's on land and more concerned with what's in the water. And so you can see these dry rocks. You can see the various islands. You can see the indications for rocky ledges over here. But what Southwick does, and this doesn't happen on all charts, but it certainly happens on his, is that he gives you the low water marks. So he literally shows you the tides in the 1760s. And we could trace these low water marks by scale. And the other thing he does, as other chart makers will, is that he tells you when you can see these ledges of rock. You can see these at low water. Ledges of rocks 10 foot at low water. But low water in 1764 would have been quite different than low water in 2020. And so in taking these, we can do some comparisons and we can start to see some of that change that Art was also talking about in his presentation. And so charts become very helpful in that sense. This is DeBar's coast of Maine from Rogers Bay to Portland Sound, including Falmouth Harbor, published in 1777, done in 1776. DeBar's charts are probably the most famous given his Atlantic Neptune. The British government, the Admiralty, invested a lot of money in publishing DeBar's charts, and he charted most of New England up into Canada. He became an official in Nova Scotia for many years as well. But I would offer the same realizations here in looking at the coves, looking at the headlands. He wants to tell you about the topography, the hydrography, but the same, marking the rocks, marking the islands, and marking the depths and soundings. And I think taking these depths and soundings and comparing them, and you can also see the low water marks and the tidal marks in the islands as well, in the islands of Casco Bay, many of which, as you can see, have kept their names, some of which have changed their names over time. And he also shows, particularly in these tidal zones and into the coves, the little black dots that you can see represent where people were living, and they represent houses and settlements. And you can see how profoundly coastal these settlements were at the time of the Revolutionary War, but he's not interested, again, as a chart maker, in the interior. And so in thinking of Casco Bay and thinking of the Gulf of Maine, and thinking about change over time in the age of shipping, in the age of sail, we move into these for, for various purposes. So they would have, the British invested quite a bit of money into this charting, especially in the Revolutionary War years. But you can also see that this charting becomes the work of economic development in Portland over time. This one is a shout out to Greater Portland Landmarks, our kind hosts for this morning. But this is a chart that was based off of DeBar's, but that was made by Lemuel Moody, who built the Portland Observatory. And in fact, the only real building he shows on the map in his inset of Portland Harbor, as you can see the little observatory right up here. But Moody's charting was commercial in purpose, but he extends the discussion of what DeBar's did. As someone who lives here and works here and stays here and is not just charting here. And so saying that there's no trees on a particular island, or that you can only see these particular rocks at low water. And looking at Little Whaleboat and looking at the ledges around, looking at the depths and soundings, some of which are a little bit different even than when DeBar's had done his chart. This is an updated chart from what DeBar's had done. And you can see the throughways, the various bridges that have been built, the growth and development of the city of Portland over time. And he drew this chart between 1825 and 1828. And so he tells you the courses are set by compass and the soundings are at low water in fathoms, right? So you have this low water at low tide. These are the fathoms around these places, and we could see the difference 200 years later. And you can see what forts are still there. And he's marking lighthouses that had been built after DeBar's charting. And so you can see the change over time, not only on land as most maps show, but the change over time in the water as charts are wont to show us. And if we move on to what we consider more contemporary views of Portland, this is a bird's eye view of the city of Portland, done and sold by subscription in 1876. And this is a significant bird's eye because it shows us changes on land, but also changes in the water. Now, this is 10 years after the Great Fire of 1866. It's showing you an incredibly commercial city, but it's also showing you a city that has been greatly changed by transportation in two ways since Moody's and DeBar's charting. One, you have the creation of canals. You have the Cumberland-Oxford Canal. You can see a canal basin in the top left, but you also have the onset of the railroads in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. And so Portland becomes a city really driven and changed by rail, and the rail changes the waterfront considerably. If you look down at the wharves, especially, and each wharf is marked by name here, the artists who worked on these bird's eye views literally would stroll the city street by street, sketching before they would go and make these drawings and have them published. You can see Lincoln Park in here and the fountain that was just restored. That would be something that you would not have seen on a map prior to 1866 because the city made a decision to make this a fire break after the Great Fire of 1866. And so you can really see the various railroads, how they're building out the wharves, the grain elevators, and the commerce of the city over time, still largely based on seaborne commerce. And you can see many types of boats and ships in the harbor, both sail and steam in this era, but certainly the creation of rail yards, of railroad bridges, of stations, has a huge impact on the city, just as the taking away of these things also will over time. And so just briefly, and just thinking about transportation, which is one of the things we can do in these changes. I would invite you not only to think about trains as transportation and how they changed the waterfront and people's work on it and how that impacts climate change, certainly, but also the trolleys. Every line that you see in red here is a trolley. And so when we imagine carbon emissions today and we think about transportation, and particularly public transportation, and something the city is certainly trying to build more of through the metro, but look at the public transportation that was available via trolley. Look where you could go from Portland, out to Gorham, out to Westbrook, all the way up into Auburn, into Hallowell, into Gardner, into the capital. You could go to Lewiston. It would take you out to Brunswick. In this little brochure, we have a couple of copies of it from a few different years. I would just show you the verso because it tells you exactly how much the trolley trips cost and also how long it took. So you could go from South Portland to Cape Elizabeth. The round trip was 20 cents in 1911, and it was an hour. Or you could have a seashore tour, or you'd have a, these are usually from Portland. But you could go all the way to Boston via trolley, 10 hours, $1.95, if you are willing to invest that. And so thinking of infrastructure as I wrap up just by showing quickly these last two maps, we also should look at the changes in the Port of Portland over time. This is a map of the Port of Portland, Maine, and the Maine State Pier in the 1930s. We are sort of ending the age of rail. But when you look at the red on the map is the Portland Terminal Company. The green is the Grand Trunk Railway. These are all rail yards, and this has changed profoundly in terms of land use over time. And so you can look at Thompson's Point, but also look at the Rigby Yard. Look at these massive swaths of land that were controlled by this form of transportation. And look at what happens after we move away from rail in the 1950s and in the 1960s. The move away from rail and the destruction of Union Station is actually what founds Greater Portland landmarks. And so then you depend more on trucking, then you invest more in highways and infrastructure. And that's going to change land use, it's going to change carbon emissions, and it's certainly going to continue this over time. And then finally, in thinking about the ways that humans impact the environment, this is a really interesting atlas that actually lives at Syracuse, but the digitized versions are in our collection. And I think Erno Bonnebaker is on today and he will recognize this particular map. But this comes from an atlas that was sort of top secret in World War II. And it wants you to look at the city of Portland and South Portland and the various metropolitan areas during World War II, when the Army Munitions Board and the Navy Munitions Board were surveying congested war production areas. And so looking at waterfront change over time in the terms of the Liberty ships being built in Portland and South Portland, but also how that changes the landscape, where people are living, the housing developments that are being built. These are essential links for people to make. A lot of today's affordable and low income housing, these housing developments were actually built for war workers working on the Liberty ships. But here you can see the oil pipelines coming in, which would not have been visible on previous maps and which also play a role in this climate change for sure. So I will definitely put the map list in so folks can take a look at some of this change over time for themselves, but also encouraging us to think about the ways in which transportation in the past and the availability of public transportation can help with our growth and development in this change over time. And I am going to turn it over to Christi. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby. That was wonderful. I absolutely love what the Osher Map Library can tell us with maps. It's amazing. And thank you, Sarah and Art. It's hard to follow up on those two wonderful conversations that we've had so far. But I'm going to bring us a little bit more into the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Okay. So, starting with how the past has shaped our present, impacted our vulnerability to sea level rise. I want to start actually by kind of broadening a little bit the scope of what we're talking about with climate change, because there's many ways in which sea level rise is tied into other climatic actions that cause us problems. Sea level rise, that causes flooding. There's problems with wave height, wave energy, and coastal erosion, all related. The loss of sea ice and thawing permafrost contributes to sea level rise. And unfortunately, more intense storms and worsened storm surge affect coastal and river areas, as do extreme rainfall events. Other issues that we have are severe droughts and heat waves, larger wildfires and longer wildfire seasons, especially on the West Coast. There's effects to air and temperature, indoor climate, and large-scale climatic patterns, and changes in habitat, species composition, and ocean acidification. So there's lots of ways in which the changing climate is having impact on our built environment, our living environment, our natural environment. Here in Maine, some of the most important things that we are concerned with is flooding, wave action, erosion, as Art mentioned, intense storms and worsened storm surge, and extreme rainfall events. All of these sometimes happen together with a hurricane or an intense storm. You end up with flooding, not just on the coast, but up into the river valleys, up the Kennebec, up the Penobscot, into the smaller rivers where we have big overflows of water. So it goes beyond the coast. This is a map that was put out by NOAA showing some of the places that would be impacted with storm surge in the Portland area. These are available online. And this is a wonderful tool, a sea level rise viewer that you can dial in for any place on the coast. So this happens to be the Pine Point area at normal sea level, current sea level. And then you can use this viewer to see what, in this case, 6 feet of sea level rise looks like when you look at these areas, okay? So you can see what happens. And I just go back again, watch the sign on the left. That's it on dry land now, and that's with 6 feet of sea level rise. So that helps you to actually figure out what we're talking about here. Okay. So how did we get here? How did we get into harm's way? As Art has already demonstrated, Native Americans had a strong relationship to rivers and coasts throughout their millennium, their existence here. And that, you know, that is not a relationship that changed when European settlers came to this shore. Europeans chose to develop their communities close to various resources in order to take advantage of them. So they built communities near waterfalls so that they could put in motive power to develop mills. They put communities on coast so that they could do shipping, and they used, you know, water was one of the biggest resources that people chose to settle by because it offered so many things. It also offered transportation, as Libby has mentioned, and it provided industry, shipping, boat building, fishing. In fact, most of Maine's non-agricultural economy developed in relationship to water resources. The cities of Saco and Biddeford are a great example of that. You have all of these incredible and Gardner, I'm sorry, this is Gardner. All of these mills along the river, you have built up industry in the vicinity of the harbor, you have transportation, you have shipping, and you have what will eventually become filled land here where Hannaford is now. So the communities really took advantage of natural resources, and water was one of the most important ones. Thus, we have many of our communities are located by the water's edge. Later, water was seen to provide recreation and leisure opportunities, and great number of seasonal buildings have been built along this shifting sands. So we have, for a couple different reasons, embraced water for industry, for transportation, for leisure, and we have a lot of buildings that are in harm's way. Communities also developed along natural transportation corridors. Some of these are valleys that are scoured by streams and rivers. This train line follows a river to the left there, and other communities developed along harbors. All of these have potential for flooding from storms or melting snow or sea level rise or tides or a combination of these. European settlement has been extended by various types of engineering. We have built bridges and causeways to allow us to live in places that we could not easily access in the age of automobiles without them. We built dams to engineer our use of water. As Libby mentioned, the Bayside and Commercial Street areas of Portland are on landfill. People have been adapting to water for thousands of years, and we have also been trying to control it for our uses. However, some of Maine's greatest natural assets now pose problems in the face of climate change. Filled land is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, as are the populations, often marginalized populations, who live on filled land. So here's a great quote that is not actually from Einstein, although many people think it is. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. We must learn from every weather event. If something can happen once, it can happen again. Flooding in Hallowell and Gardner in the 1930s is flooding in Hallowell and Gardner in the 1980s. Over and over again. Fortunately, we do learn from the past, and we do learn how to adapt. Communities adapt, people adapt, buildings and infrastructure adapt. I just want to briefly consider 3 examples. Climate change, as we know, can lead to drought and severe storms, both of which increase the risk of wildfire. Certainly the West Coast knows that. In 1947 was known as the year that Maine burned. The fall of 47 was a dry one throughout the state, and many serious fires occurred. Statewide, more than 200,000 acres, 851 permanent homes, and 397 seasonal cottages were destroyed. 16 people were killed. Reports of small fires in the woods started on October 7th, and by October 16th, there were 20 separate fires burning. By October 19th, many people breathed very smoky air. With the exception of a few homes, the towns of Shapley and Waterboro were completely destroyed. The fires swept through the forest and moved with the wind towards the ocean. And in addition to Waterboro, and Shapley, the towns of Bar Harbor, Mount Desert, Alfred, Lyman, Newfields, Kennebunk Port, Arundel, Dayton, Wells, Biddeford, and Saco suffered extreme fire danger. But communities found ways to adapt to the threat of wildfire. Although a lot of homes, historic or not, were lost, what came out of these tragedies was the new establishment of fire departments in many small and medium towns throughout Maine. It also led to the establishment of the Northeast Mutual Aid Compact, by which states in the region agreed to provide firefighting support to each other as a matter of course. And that can be a lesson to us to think about how we can learn to work together as communities across city and town boundaries to find solutions to problems that are significant to all of us in this time of climate change. Another example of community adaptation at the community level is the city of Galveston, Texas. In 1900, a hurricane struck Galveston Island, shown here, resulting in the greatest natural disaster in US history. The storm killed at a minimum 6,000 of the island's 44,000 inhabitants and caused $30 million in damage. A storm surge inundated the coast with between 8 and 15 feet of water. Every dwelling was damaged and over 7,000 buildings were destroyed. Although many residents left the city, there was substantial capital behind rebuilding, and 3 engineers were hired to design a 10-mile-long, 17-foot-high seawall. Between 1903 and 1911, the city of Galveston was raised as much as 18 feet behind the seawall. That is, fill was pumped in and the entire city was raised up 18 feet, as much as 18 feet. Work was accomplished in quarter-mile sections and involved enclosing each section at a dike and then lifting all the structures and utilities, including streetcars, including fire plugs, including water pipes, 18 feet. Some buildings had to be put up on stilts, but others, some 2,000 of them, were raised using hand-turned jack screws. This is 1903 to 1911. They raised an entire city 18 feet to get it out of harm's way, and it has worked. Lastly, let's take a look at how buildings themselves, well, actually the people who build buildings, have adapted to climate in the past. Some of the most common attributes of historic buildings were developed as methods to move or avoid water, such as basement drains, gutters of any sort, and putting buildings up on stilts or high foundations. Buildings were also adapted to provide protection from heat through the use of awnings or overhangs, or the use of double hung windows where you can lower the top sash and the heat goes out, the use of shutters, also protected from heat and light, or the use of windbreaks or shade trees. And siting of buildings was very important as well to controlling the climate around your building. So a hedgerow or windbreak might protect a farm or a building that is on a wide, open, windy area. And the famous connected complexes of Maine were often, so those are the big house, little house, back house barns, were often situated with the backside to the north, creating a south-facing dooryard and work area that was going to be warmer in the winter than the north side. As we live in and use buildings, we are constantly changing them to new conditions. Rediscovering some of these attributes will be useful in the future, and they will be joined by new short-term and long-term techniques for adapting and saving our buildings. This is something called, I just lost it. This is a technique where buildings are put on floating foundations. This building is on a floating foundation. And when the water rises in this part of Louisiana, the building floats like it's on a giant dock. It's called amphibiation. You can see the buildings next to it are not floating, they are flooding. We can learn from the past. We can look at how buildings have made adaptations before. We can realize that we're in harm's way because we need water. We've always needed water, and we need our relationship, economic, social, cultural, with water. That's not going to go away. But we have to think very hard about the choices we're going to be making and what we're going to be able to preserve and what we are not going to be able to preserve as the sea continues to rise. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much to all of our presenters today. That was just wonderful. And I have a ton of questions, I know, but I'm gonna just go straight to the question. Just as a reminder for everybody, one, that this is being recorded and will be available on our website. You can put your questions in the Q&A box. The first one we have is for you, Art. It's a question about a shell midden on property in Pretty Marsh on Mount Desert Island. If shell middens on private property are of interest to state archaeologists.
Absolutely. We have a database at the Maine Historic Preservation Commission that includes every archaeological site and everything we can find out about them anywhere in the state of Maine. So please find my email and I'll be happy to see if we have information on that site and work with the private landowner. Thank you.
Great, awesome, thanks. The second question actually is for you too, Art. Can you steer me to better information on your website or elsewhere on dugout boats that were made and used by European settlers?
I'd have to think about that. Again, please send me an email, ask the question, and I can have some papers that have bibliographies I should be able to send out.
Great, awesome, thank you. Next question is, how does one become a volunteer archaeologist?
The easiest way is to sign up to be a member of the Maine Archaeological Society. It's a statewide nonprofit. They maintain a list of people who want to volunteer, and they use that list to match up with professional archaeological digs when the time comes.
Great. So a couple other questions. So Maine's abundant water bodies, all of our oceans, rivers, lakes, are the locations of many of our early European settlements. What are other states or communities doing with similar development patterns? And is Maine working with other New England states to develop solutions? I will pose that to Christi and Libby especially too.
Well, certainly states up and down the East Coast and the Gulf Coast and internationally really are all in the same boat. You know, it's clear. Maryland has a very, very active program for assessing vulnerability and risk for their historic resources along the coastal areas. So does Pennsylvania in the Philadelphia area. And down in Florida, there's extensive work being done on archaeological sites and early communities, many of which are under threat. In terms of whether Maine is working with other states, you know, we haven't gotten to the point where Maine has a particularly focused program for documenting or undertaking risk assessments. That is something that needs to be done throughout the state so that we know what resources are at risk and how we can protect them. That's really important. But we can learn from the actions of other states that are already doing this. And the Maine Historic Preservation Commission does have a web page that is dedicated to historic preservation and climate change and has a number of resources from other states and that are pertinent also to Maine that people can look at.
Great, thank you, Christi. And I will just add too that out of Newport, a group formed a number of years ago called History Above Water, and they do conferences specifically on how climate change is impacting our historic resources, and they have a lot of resources online too, certainly that the preservation community is learning from and working with, so that's a great resource. The next question is, what evidence is there that Casco Bay Islands were connected, and what would that approximate date be? Art and Libby, maybe?
Arthur here.
Yeah.
Well, they were connected. The farther you go back in the past, the more they were connected. Mosher Island became an island sometime around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago, it was all dry land. So pick your time. Hey, you can trace how the islands became islands by doing depth contours and connecting the contour maps with the sea level rise curve over the last 12,000 years.
Great, thank you. Next question. I don't know if we can answer this, but we can try. Can the sheet pile containers to sequester combined sewage and runoff now under construction in Back Bay in Portland be considered successful adaptation?
I think only time will tell.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wait and see. Yeah, okay, thanks. Next question, would you say that Maine is in good shape assessing its assets, comparable with Maryland, for example? We realize that funding is always an issue. And you got to compliment a definite admirer of all of your work. So.
Well, the Governor's Climate Council is doing just such an incredible job of evaluating our assets, our vulnerabilities. It's looking at everything from transportation to pests to health and human services to migration of people, and putting all of that within a good context of science. I think that this Climate Council is a huge step towards putting Maine in position to move forwards over the next 20 to 50 years in terms of planning for how we're going to make the adaptations. And I would recommend anybody to follow their work, which is available on the Maine Climate Council website.
Great, thanks. And yeah, you can find more information about that on Greater Portland Landmarks website as well. And we have been submitting comments based on all of the different recommendations and following that discussion very closely. I think we have time for one last question here. Maine has many undocumented historic communities and potential archaeological sites. Are there emerging technologies that could speed up the documentation of threatened sites and aid in their preservation?
Is there technology to speed up? We can do things like ground penetrating radar and magnetometer survey and looking at LiDAR images in particular, the really high resolution aerial surveys. That helps a lot. We still have to go back and do the ground truthing. So the short answer is using historic maps and recent LiDAR technology. Yes, we can work faster, but we still have to have boots on the ground and shovels in the ground too.
I just want to add that one of the slides that I didn't actually get to show because I ran out of time introduces one of these new technologies that people are using for documenting buildings of all sorts. This is, if I can get this to play, this is the historic Jackson House in downtown Tampa. It was the first boarding house for African Americans in Tampa, Florida. And once this calls up here, it has been documented in using 3D scans and as part of a process of repairing the house. But this kind of documentation now is available to do what I call digital preservation. Sometimes we do preservation on paper. So now we're going to be moving to bits and pieces, so to speak, preservation in the digital cloud. These scans can recreate buildings. They can lead to virtual access of buildings, and they lead to certainly preservation of the information. So that was a great question. There's a lot of emerging technologies out there that are helpful. Even Google Street View provides us information to look at how buildings can be impacted by climate change. So I just leave you with this slide.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christi. Yeah, that 3D scanning technology is pretty phenomenal, and we're scheming up some ways that we might be able to use that here in our work at Landmarks as well. Thank you again to all three of you so much for being with us this morning and for such wonderful presentations and giving us a lot to think about. As a reminder to everyone, our next session on the present will be next Thursday at 8:30 in the morning, and we will have a recording of this available soon. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.